afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone, and welcome to the latest in the series of Rural Minds webinars. This evening, we will be focusing on caregivers, and we will talk a little bit more about that in just a few moments. But first of all, my name is Julie Lux. I am the Vice President of Communications at Rural Minds, and it is a great pleasure to welcome everyone to this webinar. I understand that we may have a record number of participants tonight. So before we get into our program, I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to talk to you who may not be quite as familiar with Rural Minds. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that came about because of some very profound experiences that happened to our founder and chairman, Jeff Winton. Jeff, and to his family. His much loved nephew, Brooks, took his own life a number of years ago, and it was really a wake-up call, not only to Jeff and his family, that there truly is a crisis in rural areas when it comes to mental health, but also that the stories are out there and people aren't just talking about them, they aren't sharing them. And so Jeff started researching and looking into what the needs were in rural areas to help support people in their mental health challenges. And about a year and a half ago now, maybe a little bit more, that turned into what is now Rural Minds. And I cannot do justice to Jeff's story. It is his story, and the story of his family is best told by Jeff, and he does that incredibly well on the Rural Minds website. So I encourage everyone to go to ruralminds.org, learn more about Jeff's story and the road that has brought us to Rural Minds and to our mission. And the mission of Rural Minds is to serve as the informed voice for mental health in rural America and to provide mental health information and resources. And these webinars are just one example of those types of resources. So, and we also, in doing this, we're sharing all of this information and working with other organizations. One of those organizations is the National Grange. And again, on the website, you can find out a lot more about this great partnership with this wonderful organization. And our thanks and our welcome to all of the folks from the Grange who are with us here this evening. But let's talk about tonight's webinar. As we know, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And we're going to take a little bit different look tonight because we're going to look at the important role that caregivers play. Because when someone is suffering from a mental illness, suffering from a mental challenge, they're not alone. Even if they may feel sometimes like they are alone, it affects their families, it affects their communities, and these caregivers play such an important role. So we're going to shine the spotlight, as they say, on caregivers tonight. But before we do that, first, I want to just take a minute to talk about confidentiality. Those of you who have been part of our webinars before know that we take confidentiality very seriously here. And so people watching this webinar, no one will know anyone else's identity. You'll see all of us who are presenting and who are participating and working on the webinar. But if you're a participant, your name, your likeness, nothing will be ever shown on the screen. However, that doesn't mean that we don't want you to participate. If at any point you have a question, we will have a question and answer section at the end. On your screen, there is a Q&A button on Zoom. So hit that button, type in your question. It will just be seen by those of us on the Rural Minds team, but ideally we will have some time later on at the end to answer some of your questions, and as many of them as we possibly can, but your identity will not be disclosed. And we'll have some other ways for you to participate along with the Q&A in just a little bit. But first of all, let's get right into our discussion. And I would like to welcome Brittnee Henry. Brittnee has her own very compelling and interesting story about being a caregiver of a loved one in rural America. So Brittnee, I would like to turn the platform over to you to tell us a little bit about your particular story.
Sure. Thanks, Julie. I appreciate everyone at Rural Minds putting this together. I think it's being a caregiver is a position that a lot of people take on, and we don't talk about it a lot, and the obligations that people feel and how that affects their health. So I really appreciate you all touching on this subject. So as you mentioned, I am a caregiver for my father, who has frontal temporal dementia. We have been following his dementia for a little over 10 years, and there's been various stages of that. Up until a year ago, I was living my life and building my career in Texas and Seattle. I lived away from home for 20 years. Right after college, my dad really encouraged me to go pursue your dreams. And he was living here on our family farm alone. My mother had passed in '94. And, we were just trucking along. I would say about 10 years ago, though, I received a call from my dad in which he expressed to me that he didn't, he felt that he had lost the feeling to live anymore. And that, this is a man of a strong faith, and I know that helped him. But the thoughts of suicide were in his mind. And so I knew that that was something that we needed to address right away. And being long distance away, I reached out to folks in the area that could help. But like so many people in rural areas, privacy is a big thing to them. And my dad didn't want people to know that he was feeling this way. There were feelings of guilt that he would have those thoughts, and really wanted to keep that under wraps. So he ended up driving to therapy over an hour away. And of course, when planting season came or harvest, that dropped off. We were able to get him connected to medications, but the therapy part of it really dropped off. And now looking back, I see that was part of the symptoms of his dementia. The disease process was starting. So if I fast forward to the last 2 years, it really became apparent that my dad could no longer live independently on our farm. And I chose to move home and be his advocate, even though he's in a care facility. It's really important that people have an advocate and someone that can be there on a day-to-day basis, at the drop of a hat if need be, because of the nature of the disease. With frontal temporal dementia, there's a lot of agitation, there's fear. And so it was necessary for me to move home. And since then, I'm living here on our family farm. I'm helping, manage my dad's business. And then I also started my own business to be able to work remotely for clients. So it's been a lot of, tipping your life upside down. But I've realized it's really important to take care of yourself first when you're a caregiver.
Let's talk about that, about taking care of yourself first. First of all, that was as you said, a life-changing decision to move back home. And so what have you learned to do to take care of yourself while you're caring for your dad?
Yeah, well, it hasn't been, it doesn't, when you want to care for someone and, it's sometimes hard to see how much you're slipping in your own health in your own life. And I'm very fortunate to have a best friend who is a social worker, and she works with caregivers and geriatric patients. And she said, Brittnee, it's not uncommon for caregivers to suddenly, forget to take their medication themselves, not get their prescriptions filled, to not do their preventative appointments, to not keep track of their health metrics like blood pressure and weight and things like that. And I found myself in that boat. It was the heaviest I've ever been. I was over 200 pounds. Like that's never been something that I had an issue with. I wasn't eating right. I had high blood pressure. I wasn't sleeping. And so it it really took someone saying, if you don't take care of yourself, how are you going to take care of your dad?
Mhm.
And I think reaching out for help and finding the resources that you need is so important. But that daily thought of like, how can I make sure that I'm okay so that I can take care of him is something that I religiously keep in my mind.
So you really had to make a conscious effort to take care of your own health, so that you'd be there for your dad.
Yeah.
That
Yeah. And to keep to be healthy, like show up as a healthy person at work. I've had challenges with that. When you're anxious about whether someone 1,800 miles away, took their medication today or have they fallen. And this was before I moved.
Mhm.
And so that also made it really apparent that I would need to be here because the anxiety level really did lessen when I could be here.
Oh, I can imagine that would be that, especially because you're waiting for that phone call. I think a lot of times when you're that far away, we hear people
And I
talk.
was getting phone calls. I think, there are strengths and weaknesses to being a caregiver in a rural community or being a family member who has moved away and is trying to caregive for someone in a rural community. One of the strengths is the honesty and the compassion and, having a small community, people know each other. And so I'm so grateful to this day for people who came across my dad at the bank or even at the farm, equipment shop that would call me and say, your dad was in today and he wasn't quite right. Something wasn't quite right. He was really agitated. He was having a hard time communicating. That was helpful to know that people were watching out for him and they were being honest.
And you're talking about, and there are so many good things about being in a rural community because people do look out for each other. Once, I guess once your dad was able to some extent to admit that he needed help, because that can be a challenge for some people as well. But what are some of the challenges that you see that are unique to rural communities when it comes to supporting people finding the resources that you need to support your mental health as well as your dad's?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is especially challenging and part of my graduate degree was centered around this. So it is a passion of mine, but having access to digital resources and technology was such a huge, it played a role in how my dad could receive care. And, in a rural community, there aren't a lot of specialists. We had a specialist in frontal temporal dementia who served at a hospital in another state, but it's close to us, but it's 70 miles away. My dad has gotten to the point where traveling that far, he gets very agitated. And because one, we didn't have internet service here at the farm, and two, the physician could not do telehealth across state lines. We were in a conundrum. So that is one area that, I think the rest of the world or the country is really elevating the use of telehealth and technology to provide support, but we just aren't picking that up fast enough in the rural community, and we're leaving people behind. Second, I would say there's not a whole lot of specialized care for memory and dementias in rural communities. We're very fortunate that in my hometown, the nursing home had just within like 3 weeks of my dad needing to be in a facility, had opened a memory and dementia unit. But I can say that, we still just aren't there.
Yes.
In in the care and understanding of brain diseases that we are for other diseases. And so it's been a challenge to help the facility understand and the people who work there understand what frontal temporal dementia is and how it's different, and how best to care for folks who have that specific disease. And for me, it's, oh, go ahead.
I was just that you're finding people willing to learn, they're open to learning about some of these things they may not be aware of yet.
I'm a very squeaky wheel. Having worked in brain health at major medical centers in Texas. I worked at the University of Texas Health Science Center, which has an amazing neurology and psychiatry department, and working with those folks, I knew what the disease looks like, and that the front edge of care should look like this. And a lot of those things don't trickle down to the rural areas, just because it's a very small population typically. I think, however, we don't know the true number of people who are affected by frontal temporal dementia because we don't have good diagnostics, but that's a whole nother realm of my interest.
Well, we have a couple of minutes left, and I do want to go back to one thing because I wanted to get your advice for other people who are caregivers. And you mentioned being a squeaky wheel, but also being an advocate. What is some of the advice that you can give to other people so that whether it be someone who's dealing with the situation that your father is with dementia, or someone that has a mental, some other type of a mental challenge that they're dealing with, how can their loved ones be a good advocate for them?
Read everything you possibly can about the disease. There are national organizations like the Frontal Temporal Dementia Association, Alzheimer's Association, that have great resources. I think learning about the disease and knowing what the stages are has really helped me to anticipate what this disease is going to look like as my dad progresses. I think for a lot of us, and I would count my siblings in this, as a denial of like, oh, he's fine, there's nothing wrong. And it's hard. It's really hard to see your parent change, and not be able to do the things that they once were. It's hard to fathom that, especially I think in a farm family where we look to our parents as people who are very strong and hardworking. But when they can't do those things anymore, it's hard to swallow that reality. But I think learning about the disease, reading everything that you can, and I think that the access to technology.
yes, something we all.
It's in that paradigm again, but educating yourself is really important. I think one resource that I probably didn't realize was going to be such a huge help to me was our local county public health office.
Oh, okay.
I was able to talk to an RN there, and I think I was in denial of the level of support my dad needed. Whereas I was thinking, why can't he get Meals on Wheels and just somebody to check in on him once in a while? She really helped me realize, Brittnee, your dad needs to be in a facility. And helped me go through that checklist of like, you know what, it's safest for him to be in a facility.
Yes. But as you said, that's a hard decision, and especially hard with your family and your father, who's been the rock of that family. So, but thank you so much. This is great information. We really appreciate you sharing it, but don't go away, because we're going to come back with our Q&A a little bit later on in the webinar, but we are going to move on at this point to keep things going. And we have a question for the audience at this point. So I had mentioned that we are going to keep you all, we want you all to be part of this discussion tonight. So we have a poll question for you. So if you are someone is a rural mental health caregiver, on a scale of 1 to 5, How supported do you feel by the resources available to you? So the resources currently available to you. Everyone watching, please vote. We will give you the results at the end of our next presentation. And before I introduce Travis, I do want to remind everyone that, speaking of resources, the Rural Minds website has a special section of resources for caregivers. So we would encourage you to go to ruralminds.org if for some additional resources to help you. But we'll give the results of the poll later. But right now, it is my pleasure to introduce Travis Carlson. Travis is an independent filmmaker, and I want to say an award-winning independent filmmaker, who is going to talk about not only his experiences growing up in rural Western New York, but his lived experiences through his film Mother's Day, which depicts his journey with his own mother during her mental health challenges. So Travis, if you want to join us.
Yes, thank you.
There he is. Good evening, and thank you so much for being here. Again, remind everybody to vote on our poll. And with that, Travis, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Julie and Brittnee. I'm very glad to have heard your story. It's very impactful and has so many correlations to the story and I guess situation I was in and people I know. So glad we're all here together. So as Julie said, yeah, my name is Travis. I'm the writer and director of a film project called Mother's Day, which was a feature film we did, but it's also a true story. It's the story of my mother and me. And in this film, we try to depict an honest slice of life, basically a reenactment of one difficult day in which we found ourselves in our small town dealing with certainly mental health situations and also regular family dynamics. And it all kind of comes together to what I would say is a big part of being a caregiver, especially me in this story, I was about 25 years old, and no one really. Sometimes you don't get told that there's a big situation about to happen. You have to sort of slowly discover that the situation that you're in or that your loved one is in is unique and different. So I think today I'm going to explore sort of that discovery of transition, where I saw myself and saw my mother kind of become someone different, and how I needed to change and react. And as we'll talk about, this is also, how it impacted the rest of our lives. So this film we shot in a unique way. It's a continuous single shot. So like the movie 1917 from a few years ago, we had 2 hours and 2 miles. There were no cuts in between the shots. And that worked pretty well. We had a few film festivals give us best actress and best of the festival in Queen's World. And this was really a huge honor, because the project that we worked on, Mother's Day, was competing against projects with fully funded budgets and some serious star power. And unlike that, everything you're about to see was created by myself and a very small team who actually volunteered over a year of our working lives to tell this story. I know many of you here feel the same power and energy around getting the word out and destigmatizing mental health. And today I wanted to share why our team chose to do that. And I'm going to show you New York City, the origin of so many important and cinematic stories. And only curveball to say that our story has nothing to do with New York City, but actually a different town in New York called Gary. And this is a pretty iconic view of our skyline. We have one convenience store and one stoplight. But this is home. I was raised here. My parents were raised here, so were their parents. And we were part of a population of just over 1,000 people spread out across 36 miles. And so to do the math there, that's about 47 people per square mile. And that might seem like a lot, like kind of crowded, but by comparison, that same square mile in New York City 30,000 people. It's a slight difference. And first lesson of the day, maybe that is why I saw a lot more movies set in New York City than New Yorkers saw about rural America. And if we wonder what they might have saw, well, things like this, a family riding the lawnmower. Like my mother before me, I grew up on a farm on a hill. We had our own gas well, water well, pond, horses, land, pretty much everything except cable. And we were just a little too far from civilization for the company to run the wires. And so my grandparents, who lived in town here in this house, would actually videotape the television and movie programs, and then we would pick them up in our car and drive them home and then watch them at home. And that's how my mom got me started in movies. And soon they became my entire goal in life. And fast forward a couple years later, I found myself on the team that was producing all of the creative content for the NFL and NHL teams in our area. And we'd made a few short films that screened at the Cannes Film Festival, one of the most important festivals in the world, 3 years in a row. And yet you don't get to have those experiences in creating something that powerful without a team. And I'm sure, as many of you can relate to, at the beginning of all of these journeys, usually your first and only teammate, when you're still kind of weak and at your worst, is your mom. And this is mine. She made all of the difference in the foundation of my career and my life and my education. And she was a really strong student herself. She had a really successful career. She was a busy mother. And like I alluded to, if there were any tendencies or yellow flags that we might now say were probably a mental health condition, at the time, our family just chalked that up to kind of annoyances or personality trait particular to her, idiosyncrasies. And I would say, what else was there? We weren't sure. So to answer that, my family would need to experience a watershed moment that we couldn't really see coming. And I pulled up this map of Gary and the hills surrounding it because just north of home, one of these hills is not really much bigger than any of the ones around it, but a raindrop on one side of the hill, the north side of these hills, will flow into the Great Lakes and over Niagara Falls and into the Atlantic Ocean. Just a few inches south, that same raindrop would flow all the way into the Gulf of Mexico. So this subtle watershed also was happening in our family. And a day that didn't seem any bigger than the others, but it was certainly, in retrospect, marked by this conversation. On the one side of it was the identity of my mom I just talked about, this loving woman who always knew, as self-sufficient and capable, as Brittnee alluded to, the same way she saw her father. And she was aging and strained by some isolation, but only a few hours later through this talk, and just like water flowing on the other side of a hill into a different ocean completely, I'd come to realize that there was this new identity. And she was still a loving woman, but she was also confused. She had explosive anger and fears and distorted worldviews, and unfortunately some life-threatening lack of judgment that was very concerning. For my part, I no longer recognized her inside of her behavior. And this would continue to get worse, in the days and weeks and months and years following. So for my part, during this conversation, I was transitioning from being a son who was just offering impatient advice to his mother to suddenly feeling kind of overwhelmed and surrounded by a toxic condition that was a lot bigger than me. And then here's the thing, we didn't talk about it. And I think that's one of the biggest turning points and things that should have gone differently. I don't even think I told my dad. She had demanded that I keep a lot of life-changing events secret from him. And as Brittnee alluded to, and Julie, that there's just a sense of privacy that felt very pervasive. So it was probably the most complex and emotional day of my family's life, certainly my life, and we never talked about it. And so for about 5 years, our family was stuck and kind of getting worse, and I certainly didn't know what to do. And it wasn't just the privacy. I want to bring you back to this picture because living on a hill in rural America with slow internet, films were my education. And films that deal with mental health conditions of any kind were these: axe murderers, villains, parodies, a lot of violence. And these were not even close to my mom's situation. And the stats are even bleaker. For Hollywood's depiction of America to be consistent with reality, over 20% of its characters should have a mental health diagnosis. And yet what we see is less than 2. It's 1.7% of any film character from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of movies every year even experience a mental health condition. And so this lack of information creates ignorance. But even worse, negative depictions create stigma. And of the handful of characters who do represent mental illnesses to moviegoers, 63% of them are perpetrators of violence. Whereas real people with mental health conditions are more likely to be victims of violence rather than perpetrators. And what I've found through all of our culture, but specifically in movies, anytime we see a negative depiction, it's creating a stigma, plain and simple. Negative depictions create stigma. And so from the information I had, of course, I didn't know where my mom fit into this scenario, this soup of behavior and things I wasn't aware of. Was she crazy? No. And was she the American Psycho? No. She wasn't a supervillain. But at the same time, she wasn't what I was seeing on the other side, these exaggerated Hallmark movies of a perfect family, especially country life gets rather glamorized, the country music version of life. And it wasn't exactly that either. So, and people who live in rural settings aren't stupid. They're some of the smartest, sharpest people I know come from rural settings. But when the only mention in your universe of a mental health condition is it dangerous or villainous or just not grounded in reality, of course it isn't chatted about. And we just can't know what we don't learn. And so I believe that there's a genuine and severe technology lag to deliver reliable information and culture. And of course there is, because it's 47 people per mile compared to 30,000. And that slower information will amplify the outdated information. So just to take New York City as an example, it would have 8 million more chances to tell an important story about their way of life compared to rural America. So you can start to see the watershed, kind of the epiphany that we were having as a team, and myself in particular. And that goal for us was to amplify a new and an honest film, and not just another pamphlet at the hospital, but to be a part of popular media and to meet people in the same place that they get their other influential information. And it really didn't matter that we didn't have a huge budget to finance the film or access to Hollywood equipment or stars, because we were willing to show up. And as a small group of outsiders, we were going to do our best. And I thought I would take just 2 minutes to show you a glimpse at what we came up with. So here's the trailer to Mother's Day.
This is so nice, huh? Isn't it? Sitting out in the yard. So great, seeing all of you grow up around here.
Maybe I can get something pulled off here and finish one of these endless projects.
You're a lot like me. You know that? Mr. Hansen says I should be using my walker now, for the disability case, but it's so embarrassing. And the neurologist says I can't drive anymore. I told you that, right?
Yeah.
I can't stay in Cary.
You're considering moving back to Florida? I mean, you just got back here, right?
But Dr. Brainerd said I wasn't supposed to tell anyone.
What? You were valedictorian, and you were like the leader of your college program. Where's that Wendy?
Don't lose hold of me now.
So much medication, for the anxiety and the angry now. so worried.
Because it's a big deal. It's a huge deal, Mom. That is all of yours and Dad's money. Like, did you sign anything or read anything?
I don't.
You don't know, Mom. I am so sick of being the bad guy. It's worse than the warnings we gave you before last time. This will be worse.
Please. God, why can't you just love me, Jordan, love, and just go back to your father?
I want to lose my mom.
I'm gonna trade you for the world.
Okay. So we'll take a little breath there. But that's sort of a glimpse into the story in that watershed that I was talking about. And I'm sure almost all of you have someone in mind when you see this. Maybe someone who hasn't been on the screen before, but what I feel is that their story is probably just as important as the next superhero reboot or the next Fast and Furious. And it's because it's real and it's honest. And honesty was really the guiding star to how we did every decision of this project. And it had to be, because I didn't feel like I knew how to solve the issues of mental illness in rural America, or even how to do what was best for my mom. But I did feel like I could represent it accurately. And I think that's one empowering thing that we all have, for those of us who are close to it, is that we can share and talk and listen accurately. And we can add one more example to the universe of common mental illness, or maybe it's an uncommon mental illness, or whatever situation that your family is dealing with. Maybe it's not even a mental illness, but just a stressful time. I think we're all going through that, and it's so important to shed some light on that. So that was our mission, to open up a cinematic window, but this time into a very real rural life. And this unusual thing happened. We were in the actual location where this took place. We shot it in the actual location because we still had access to it. And as we were doing a rehearsal, the neighbor of the house, with this sort of gruff blue collar man, he didn't love the idea of us long-haired filmmakers walking around his junk pile. So for the whole rehearsal, he sat up there about 3 hours, and he listened to the entire story. And what's amazing is that it worked. This neighbor, Brian, pulled me aside for almost an hour after, and I was glad to do it, but almost till midnight, he just talked his heart out about his brother and a very similar situation that was going on in his family. So only one door down. So I think one of the things, if we think of country people as, even the hard ones being so tough and not willing to talk, but they were, this machinist was very willing, and he just needed someone else to go first. And, in this situation, my family's truth and a little bit of vulnerability allowed him kind of permission to share his story and get it off his chest. So it's my hypothesis that people do want to talk, and that there's really nothing to be afraid of. And that on the other side of that, they want help, and they want to find a path to recovery and stability. I know I wanted that for my mother, and I know that she wanted that. And so we did take that as an excuse to keep going forward and to try to pay it forward. And that's why about a dozen of us risked everything. We were a very new, small company, and kind of still are. And we gave up a salary to get the story out here. And when it was done, this is a brief glimpse of how some of the people reacted to it.
Oh my gosh. The opening scene was the most thrilling experience I've had in a while.
Whoa, that was a really cool thing.
Really impressed, blown away. One of the best opening shots I've ever seen.
It's incredibly ambitious, and then not only is it ambitious, but to successfully accomplish a one-shot film, I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing.
I thought that was amazing. I'm not really sure what makes your movie amazing. I just know that I cried a lot, and
this is not a film that you watch, you experience this film, you ingest this film. What an opportunity to have a piece of work that allows you to share and feel these emotions.
You can relate to all of this, you know, in a way that I think it's so important for people to see.
I feel like I learned a lot.
It really touched me.
It was very raw, like very real. I forgot at times that I was watching a film.
It did feel like a documentary at some moments, like we were watching real people having a real conversation. And
Yes.
You know, you felt for each one of them and you could see their point of view.
I think it's really brave and a beautiful thing because there are so many people who have such similar stories.
We've lived that. We lost our son, our only child, to suicide. It was extremely true to nature as far as what the family goes through.
I mean, the caretakers themselves deal with a lot. I was told I got PTSD. I watched my brother die. You know, so it showed both ends. It showed the caretaker's point of view and how that caretaker's trying to be there for the family member. It also showed the mental health point of view.
I thought it was extremely well portrayed, and I thought it was extremely well written.
What I saw was very real, and the frustration that the son had for the mother, and the mother not really realizing, and then realizing, then not. I've been there, done that, and yeah, it brought a lot of home. I mean, I hope people pay attention to that movie, because I think it's going to help a lot of people.
You guys got to really keep making films like that. That's no joke. People need to know, you know, what it's like to have mental illness.
These responses came from rural settings as small as Gary to mid-sized cities to New York City. Students and farmers and art critics. And that's, I think, because stories can transform people. And if stigma is going to breed stigma, then I think that the truth breeds the truth. And, you know, these might not be the most amazing parts of myself or my mother, and she is amazing. But she and I both agree that this probably could do a lot more good for other people than showing the amazing parts. And so I just think people need to hear someone else talk first. And I know that the more that we do talk honestly, the more that we're teaching and the more that we're learning. And so for me, going from somewhere and someone who was very confused and alone and felt like I was the only person who had access to my mom's story and felt like it was all on my shoulders. I think it's just so important to have other examples out there, so that if you know, some official authority doesn't come down and say, this is exactly what's going on and this is sort of the blueprint forward, that we're there and we're looking for those signs for our friends, and just making it more part of the conversation, so people can bump into that and recognize that. And hopefully Mother's Day does that, but I think especially a lot of you probably have that power too. So I just wish that today, I want to encourage, I guess, all of you to tell your story and to listen to others. So thank you so much for your attention, and yeah, I appreciate it.
Wow, Travis, thank you so much. I think this is the second or third time I've seen your presentation, and I get chills when I see those clips every single time. So very, very grateful to you. I'm going to start, and then we're going to get to our poll results in a minute. But first, how can people see your film?
Yeah, so the film is available to stream anywhere in the world through our website, so panamericanfilms.com, PANamericanfilms.com.
Okay, thank you, because I imagine we're going to have a few people out there who are going to want to see the full thing based on that. But we do have some questions for you and Brittnee. But before we get to those, let's see the results of our poll. As you remember, I think that, and forgive me, my eyes, I have to get in here. Do you feel that you have resources? And I think the three right in the middle, most people are saying some, but not enough. So Certainly there are more opportunities to provide more resources, and certainly is one of the things that that Rural Minds is dedicated to, not only in our own situation but also in the partnerships that we have with so many different organizations. Jeff, someone had mentioned the National Alliance, I have to make sure I get this right, National Alliance for Mental Illness, NAMI, and that's an organization that that Rural Minds is working with very closely. As Jeff's often said, we're not here to reinvent, we don't want to duplicate any efforts. We want to work with people to come up with more efforts, more things, but things that are efforts and programs and information that is specific to rural America and the challenges that people face, just like Travis did in rural America. And I do have a question for you here. First of all, thanks from our founder and chairman, Jeff Winton, and he had a question that was actually one I was thinking of while we were watching this, but Travis, what does your mother think? How is your mother doing? And what does she think? What was her reaction to the movie?
Sorry, I was muted.
I wondered if it was me. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it was a half of an answer, but so my mother was the first person we reached out to, or I reached out to when I wrote the project. And the first thing I would say is it was great because we talked about this day and we had never talked about it before. So 5 years later, we could kind of go over it again with a clear head, and that's good. And a lot like Jeff Winton's story, she was inspired by someone else in town who had a funeral, and mental illness was talked about openly at that funeral. And she found that was a really profound thing, and gave her the courage to say, you know what, I think this has an opportunity to help people, and there's no reason not to do that. So she gave her blessing, and yeah, and she's on her path to recovery in Florida right now. So yes.
That's good. Wonderful to hear. What about the community? What about the folks in Gary the first time that they heard about and that they saw the movie?
Some of them you saw in the audience reactions actually were there from Gary speaking about it. It's a bit of a surprise for some people who are like, wow, I knew you my whole life and I didn't understand this was happening. So that's one more reason to make sure that we are talking to our friends and coworkers. Something Brittnee had said earlier too about, one of the pros of living in a small town, I feel the same way, that like, I don't think anyone ever was like ganging up on my mom, or, there's a lot of support. And I think there would have been even more if we would have been more open about it. And in retrospect, I think, the family feel would have been there as more than, gossip or some of the cattiness. I think there would have been the support if we would have engaged a little bit more.
Give people a chance.
Yeah,
absolutely. Brittnee, I want to harken back to our poll question here, because we saw people were kind of in the middle as to whether or not, how they felt about having the resources that they needed as caregivers. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about what are some of the resources you would like to see for caregivers that you don't currently think are available or don't see in your community.
I think, and this is ubiquitous for every rural community, but more access to psychologists and social workers, people that you can talk to about your situation, and easier access to those resources. I was very fortunate in that I recently had a visit with a primary care physician who was very astute at, asking me the questions like, what are you going through and what's happening? And, we've seen this huge weight loss, and are you okay? And really being an advocate for me to talk to someone, like, this is something serious that you need to talk to someone. So I think having more primary care physicians who are attuned to those kind of needs of their patients in rural areas, because they are seeing these people, they're the front door. And I think, you know, there are support groups, and I have to be honest, I haven't utilized the resources like I should. And it's easy to get caught up in like, oh, well, nothing's available. But until you really search it out and try it, just show up for yourself. And you might, you know, meet people that, hey, I didn't know you were going through this too. And in a small community, that can be really empowering. And like Travis said, you know, if you're brave enough to talk about it, maybe someone else will be, and you create that community of, you know, knowledge and making it okay to say that we need help. I think that's both part of the grittiness of rural America, but also our downfall is that we suffer in silence a lot, or we isolate, or we try to make it look like we're strong and we don't need help. But really, it's the other way around. The strongest folks are the folks that reach out. And then just technology. Technology is, you know, even to see films like Travis's, and to know that, you know, there are resources out there just to even educate yourself. I think that's really important, and it's lacking in rural America.
It's sometimes just taking that first step, but as you say, it's not always easy. How about you, Travis? Any resources that we haven't talked about that you think, from your personal experiences, would have been helpful to have, maybe at the time your mother was truly going through her initial challenges?
Yeah, I think the two things I would say is, and the one I spent sort of a lot of the conversation about, but I wanted to see examples of people going through situations that were like mine, as opposed to idyllic country song versions of their life. I wanted to see real life examples of someone saying like, hey, this is normal and it's okay. And we've been through that. So I think the cultural shift would be my biggest thing. And the second little thing to mention is, after making the film, one of the groups I came in contact with was just something that we all know a lot about now recently, but the suicide and crisis service hotlines, the 988 number. Brittnee alluded to it, but you know, I think I probably would have heard before that there were hotlines and stuff, but always I treat 911 this way too. Like, I wouldn't call it unless it's like, you know, a true natural disaster outside. I would just assume I probably shouldn't. But you know, they've assured me like, no, you can call if you have a question about it. I'm like, so as a caregiver, I'm like, I am not having the mental illness problem or situation, but I should have used it and called and just said like, what's going on, and what is available, if anything. So don't be shy about the 988 number. It's anonymous, it's free. You know, use it however you want.
But that there, and again, that's something you can do via the phone. We don't have to depend on those of us in rural areas who have undependable internet services. Brittnee, I have a question for you here, harkening back to the fact that for the first part of the situation, before you made that decision to leave your job and move back home to be with your dad and to help him, how did you navigate a full-time job while also having giving care to your, you know, and taking care of your dad, especially when it was long distance? How did you manage that?
Well, I don't know that I managed it the best. There was a lot of interruptions in my day to call him, especially when I was in Washington and there was a time difference. That was really difficult. I didn't handle it well, and I know that it showed up in my work, in my temperament, and the way I was able to, you know, show up for my colleagues. Again, I think it's really important to have the insight that, you know, something, you know, this is not how I want to show up, and reaching out for help to navigate that. And be honest with your employer about what you're going through. I think I found employers that were super supportive and understood what I was dealing with, and helped me have a more flexible schedule. But I've also seen it work the other way in that, if my dad had had cancer or needed dialysis or needed someone to take him, for cancer treatments, they would have been, oh, that's fine to work from there. But because it was a brain disorder, it was treated differently. And I really hope we get to the point in this country where diseases of the brain, and you'll notice I don't say mental health, because I really do think, like, if we are going to get over the stigma, it's about the brain. It's the same as, my dad's path with this. The behavioral things that he was experiencing were part of a neurological, like a neurodegenerative disease. The depression and the anxiety, it's all connected. And when we talk about brain disease, I think it helps to take away some of that stigma. But yeah, I found, my requests for being able to work from here were not treated the same by the employer as folks who had parents going through cancer treatment. And I really hope that changes. So there are definitely challenges with your employment. I think remote work is a blessing. And I hope the trend continues. I know there are a lot of companies that are asking people to come back and show up in the office, but with more, we've got, it's something crazy, like 44 million unpaid caregivers in this country. Let's give them some kind of flexibility to keep their jobs and keep their lives going, so they can take care of their loved ones.
Wow, that's quite a staggering figure, and to know that. But I think
75% of those people are women.
Yes, I'm sure.
The average age of that woman is 49. So it's hitting them right in the prime of their careers. We've got to give support and flexibility to those folks.
That's staggering too. But thank you for sharing that information, because I think that's it's important to keep that in mind, that there are so many people out there that are providing support, and as you said, unpaid caregivers, but then they're also trying to juggle a paying job at the same time.
Even the impact of the health outcomes of people who are caregivers cost our country $93 billion last year.
Wow.
We need to address the unpaid caregivers' lives in this country and understand the impact it has.
Well, and it is critically important. And again, we're doing our small part, but there's a whole lot, as you're saying, that needs to be done. Travis, as we're getting ready to wrap up here, what's your ultimate goal for Mother's Day? What would you like to see this movie do, and how can it help not only the people who are suffering with, I'm learning, brain diseases, but how would you like to see this movie make a difference?
Yeah. I think certainly in having folks watch it, and if you know people who might, so I feel like it's a good watch if you're someone who doesn't. So for people who maybe haven't experienced a mental health situation or brain disease, as we might say, it's a really good introduction to sort of that subtle transition, and really can help you give your own mind a workout into saying, like, well, where would I fall on this side of it? What would I do in this situation? Or let me see a family dynamic as it plays out that way. And then I would say just a little bit larger, that we're as a team pushing to share this in different communities. So if anyone here would like to have the film screen in their town, we have easy financial ways to make that happen. And just to spread the word and allow your town to sort of have that conversation. So panamericanfilms.com is a great place to get in touch with us if you are interested in something like that.
Great. Having that conversation, I think that's something that we, as you mentioned earlier, Jeff's family, your family, Brittnee, all of the people and so many other people that we talk to all the time, it's helping people have that conversation because then making that first step, which could be just knowing that you're not alone, that you're not the only person experiencing this. So I cannot thank both of you enough for sharing your stories with us this evening. This has been fascinating information. And I think hopefully you'll get more people. Those who have internet service will can view the movie. But also thanks to all of you who have joined us. You will be, those of you who are watching, you will be receiving a short survey from Rural Minds, and we would ask you to please take a couple of minutes and answer the questions, because the information you provide will help us to determine subject matter for upcoming webinars. The one we're having right now came out of some of the questions and the interest of the people who responded from previous webinars. As always, our appreciation to our friends at the National Grange. You can learn more about our partnership with them at ruralminds.org. And finally, as we close, I want to remind everyone that Rural Minds is a 501c3 nonprofit. Then we do rely on the donations as well as corporate financing to develop the educational content and programs such as this webinar. So we invite you to go to our website and help us help others by a donation to Rural Minds. So again, all of our thanks and good evening.